Welcome to my talk. My name is Dave Patrick. This is Intro to Azure for SharePoint Geeks. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer, solution developer, solution expert, MVP. I have a lot of letters in my name. I take a lot of Microsoft exams. If anyone is interested in certification, please reach out to me, tweet me at David E. Patrick on Twitter. I love to talk about ways to, different. In fact, in this talk, I'll talk about some exam resources that are available for Azure, since this is an Azure talk. So a little bit more about me. I am an MVP. Got my first one in 2009 for, of all things, Microsoft Great Plains. Lately, I've been getting it for Office apps and services, specifically for my work with SharePoint, but I do a lot of Microsoft Teams. I'm a developer. I also do administration and training. My official title is SME, Subject Matter Expert, for the U.S. Army at Aberdeen Proving Ground here in Maryland on the East Coast of the USA. If anyone's interested, looking for a job, tinyurl.com, DSA job. We have positions across the United States, including Hawaii, which I'm a big fan. We have Java developers out there, so I always try to tell my company that I know JavaScript, and I try to say the script real low, but they always catch it, and that's why I'm still in Maryland, not in Hawaii. I also run a couple of user groups. The one I like to highlight here is MAD SharePoint, stands for Mid-Atlantic Developers SharePoint, but it's also because sometimes SharePoint drives us nuts, and we are now doing a lot of a lot of virtual talks. So we used to do hybrid, way back in the beginning, we used to do in person, solely in person. Then we were doing hybrids. Now we're totally virtual. So that means people from all over the world can attend. People from California can attend our monthly meetings. So go to madsharepoint.com for more information. All right, excellent. So little about my company. They make these talks possible. They support me. Again, they're a gold partner, which is exciting. A lot of access to Microsoft. If you want to be on the bleeding edge of Microsoft, work for a gold partner. This company in particular has been around since 1963, so over 50 years. So they're not going anywhere anytime soon. But we're a small company, 400 people, give or take. So we've got that kind of established feeling, but also a small company feeling. And we do a lot more than just SharePoint, more than just collaboration and knowledge management. We do cybersecurity, identity management, network engineering, systems engineering. Just if it's IT, we do it. Definitely look into us. I'll put up a link later if you or just reach out to me. I'd love to talk about careers at my company. Also, my another plug for my Mad SharePoint. Just go to our site, attend our meetings. I'm still figuring out how to give away virtual swag. So I used to be a big freebie buff and give out, T-shirts and hats and all sorts of whatever companies would send me. We'd love to give out, in person. But I'm still getting stuff. Last meeting, we gave out some Pluralsight subscriptions, 1 month subscriptions to Pluralsight, which is a great online video training company. So yeah, check us out and win some free stuff. Thanks to our sponsors for M365 California. We've got Crush Networks Inc., SharePoint List, Pixel Mill, IT Proof, and Butterfly Technologies. Again, even though we're virtual, there's still costs associated with this, so we really, really appreciate that these companies have stepped up and provided support and sponsored this event. Again, it wouldn't be possible without their help and support. All right, so what's the agenda for today? I really want to talk about what is Azure and how, as a SharePoint person, I can take advantage of that. I've given this talk a few times already. And one time I gave it at the Project Management Institute, and someone asked a question that made me add some more content to the talk. And the question that they asked, this project manager said, hey, in cloud computing, is there any hardware? And that really threw me for a loop. It was kind of like a punch in the gut. I said, wait a minute, what do you mean, is there any hardware? Of course there's hardware. Well, he said, well, I heard of serverless computing, so I thought maybe there was a, cloud computing actually didn't have any hardware. And I thought, well, I don't know what he did think. It was some biomass up in, I'm not really sure what he was imagining, but it absolutely still requires hardware. So I added these sections to this talk about just the basics of cloud computing. We'll go do a quick overview of what it is, physically what's putting it together. I got some cool pictures. We'll talk about some of the models for delivering cloud computing and the types of services that you can get. Then we'll dive into what is Azure, how can you get started, what can you create, how do you manage the things that you create, how you can get credits and do things for free. I'm a big cheapskate, aka frugal. And we'll talk about how you can then use it for SharePoint, like doing things like creating SharePoint farms. So cloud computing, what is it? This is the practice of using a network of remote servers hosted on the internet to store, manage, and process data rather than the server down the hall. And I used to work for a company where we actually literally had a server down the hall. It was on the 4th floor. It was in an air conditioning room. And every time something went wrong with that server room, our website went down. And our website was supposed to be up 100% of the time. So we went through a long, several-year effort of fortifying that server room. We just had redundancy left and right. If the air conditioning went out, we ended up having redundant air conditioning. If the power went out, we had a generator installed in the bottom floor. When our internet provider went out, we ended up signing up for dual, AT&T and Verizon. So every time something went wrong, we were like, okay, let's learn from that. What ended up happening is we spent over $1 million fortifying this little, for one website to have basically our own private cloud. Now people realize there's much better economies of scale to let someone else do it, like Microsoft or from another cloud provider, and use their cloud services. It just doesn't make sense for a small company to invest that much money in their own private cloud. So as I mentioned, the cloud isn't really a cloud. That's just a name for using the internet in this fashion. What is it really? Well, it's made possible by the virtualization. The idea that you can take actual hardware, these blade servers, and then run some virtualization software, whether it's VMware, Hyper-V, or whatever. And then on top of that, you run one or more operating systems, and in each one of those you can run one or more applications. So you've got that hosted or bare metal architecture, but there's that layer of cloud software on top of that, and then on top of that is your actual app and your actual operating system that runs virtually. And this kind of encapsulation allows us to do things like if my app crashes, right? If one of these apps were to go down, well, it's not going to affect the other ones. This whole OS could go down. The other ones are isolated. And even if multiple went down, or even if this particular one died, there's redundancies, right? There's other blades built in. In fact, this is a typical data center, and you can see each one of these guys in the wall here is one of those blades. And I've heard stories of kids in roller skates rolling down and looking for a little blinking red light, and they just yank one of those out and put in a fresh one. And then the software is smart enough that it just brings it up and provisions it and automatically replaces the one that died. So cloud computing at its optimal is such that we have all these redundant computers that can watch out for each other and prevent those crashes and give us we don't ever get the 100% uptime, but we get closer and closer there, 99.9 or 99, what do they say, the 5 nines, 99.999% uptime. Now Microsoft has over 50 of these Azure regions, which is more than any other cloud provider. At least this was true when I took a screenshot of this slide. Last I checked, it was up to 54, and I know they even sunk one out in the ocean. But the interesting thing about these regions, so each one of these regions has multiple data centers, or could have multiple data centers, is that you'll see that some of them are actually dedicated to the Department of Defense or the U.S. government. So I work for the Department of Defense. I have access to some of these regions, but many of you do not. So even though we have all these different data centers, some are accessible or public, and some are more secured. I wouldn't call them private, because private is generally, when you refer to a private cloud, that's per company, but they're not quite as public as some of these other data centers. In fact, here's a picture of the USA's DoD cloud. I won't tell you where it is. That's a secret, but no, it is. You can look it up. But yeah, the interesting thing about this one is that it is in a bunker. It's in a in a hill behind gates with a guard. This is an old picture. You can tell by the car right there. But yeah, it's very secure. That is a private cloud. So that our particular DoD cloud, the one that the Army runs or the Department of Defense runs, is you have to log in, you have to have special computers and smart cards and credentials and security clearance and all that to get access to them. That's a good example of a private cloud. Now, when we're talking about cloud, you tend to think about this idea of a generational shift of the computing platform. So back in the days in the 50s, where you had those mainframes and that really fashionable dress, everything was centralized. You had thin clients. The cost of the computer was the expensive thing, right? We were optimizing the infrastructure because computers were the things that were the high cost. Then, what was that, 70, 80, 90s, we had client-server computing, right, where PCs came about and they were cheap and powerful. So we did this whole idea of doing, back-end, front-end, client-server, thin we architect for agility because computers were much cheaper than they were previously. But now we're trying to get sort of the best of both worlds. We want that centralized. We want to be able to fire up servers quickly and cheaply. So we have clouds that allow us to do that, but we still have these powerful clients that can pull the data down and work with them. And now we switched this model it's a pay as you go, and only for what you use. And so that's really important. That's an important aspect of cloud computing. And when we're talking about aspects of cloud computing, this is Microsoft's Young Chow came up with this 5 essential characteristics of cloud computing. Or actually he put together the 532 model. This is one of them. And the idea is that if you're doing cloud computing, it should have on-demand self-service, right? This idea that I want to fire up a SharePoint farm in Azure. So I go into the portal and I say, start my web front end, start my SQL Server, start my Active Directory. Those computers all they start on demand. And then I start paying for them. I'm jumping over to the other side here. Measured service with pay per use. So after I start my server, and then I pay while they're being run. If I'm done with them, I turn them off. And this is a very real-world scenario for a lot of my developers. So I work with about 20 or so SharePoint developers. And what we use Azure for is we will create SharePoint farms, and I'll show you how to do one really easily. I'll show you a couple different ways to create SharePoint farms using Azure. But we'll create one, and then we'll do some testing, and then we'll turn it off. So we're on demand creating these farms, and then when we're done with them, we turn them off, and they don't use our credits anymore. Some other benefits of cloud computing, some other characteristics of cloud computing is the idea of ubiquitous network access. So my developers can do that from anywhere. They can be sitting at the office, they can be sitting at home, they can be on the beach in Hawaii, wherever they're at, they'll be able to access their servers. It's really transparent to them. And that's sort of the next thing, that's location transparent resource pooling. So, behind the scenes, they might have their Active Directory machine on the East Coast or the West Coast, and those different data regions that we talked about, but it doesn't really matter to the end user. It's transparent to them. The last thing I like to talk about is this idea of rapid elasticity. This is something that a lot of people don't quite realize. That's one of the big benefits of cloud computing. The idea that if I put up a website and my website is giving away coupons, and there's a real neat story about how Outback Steakhouse, back in around 2009 timeframe, was giving out coupons for the blooming onion, which is delicious. And the first time they did it, on their own servers, and everyone wanted a coupon, so the website crashed because it just couldn't handle the load. So the next time they did it, they used cloud computing, and that time, as the website got busy, another computer automatically fired up and handled the additional load. And as that got busy, another computer. So the idea of rapidly, provisioning more computers to handle the load rather than just crashing. That's a big benefit of cloud computing. That's really where Amazon got their start, right? They had all these computers for Christmas time or for the holidays because they needed to handle all the sales, but then afterwards they were just sitting around and so they start renting them out to people. So rapid elasticity is a really interesting and sometimes overlooked characteristic of cloud computing. Now, what about the 3 cloud service delivery methods? You guys, I'm sure, have heard this before, right? Software as a service is where you're using the cloud. Platform as a service is where you're taking the cloud and you're putting some software into it and you're leveraging and making an application from it. And then infrastructure as a service is where you're really taking almost full control. You've got these virtual machines, but you're installing the software, you're running the application, and you're creating your own app running from not bare metal but close to it. The way I like to think of it, if that's a hard concept to think about, is I'm a big food guy. I like to think about pizza, right? If you're making pizza for dinner and you're doing it at home all by yourself, that's analogous to on premises where you've got to do everything, right? You do dining table, soda, drinks, everything. If you start to use cloud computing, you give up some of the responsibility to whoever your cloud provider is. So that's infrastructure as a service, where you might actually have a virtual machine, but then you still install, say, SQL Server and your web front end and all that. So in the pizza analogy, it's take and bake. So you go and you buy the pizza, but you still got to bake it and do everything else and set the table. The next level up, again, you notice there's less and less you manage as you leverage more and more of the cloud. So platform as a service is where the pizza's delivered. So it's already baked and delivered. You still have to set the table and pour the drinks, but the vendor did way more. And a good analogy in Azure would be using SQL Azure. So You're no longer concerned about the operating system. You're no longer concerned about patching SQL. You're just, I need to use SQL, and so that's a step above just say using a virtual machine. Finally, software as a service is really turnkey, where you're saying, do it all for me. Like in the pizza world, we go out and just have pizza at Bertucci's or someplace like that. In the software as a service, a good example would be like using Office 365, using Word and Excel. You don't have to install all that. You just need a browser and you're just running the software. The last thing from the 532 model is the 2 deployment models. And we talked about this already. Private clouds, where it's inside your data center, you have total control behind the firewall. That's what we saw with the DoD cloud. And then there's public clouds like Azure and other places that are available to anyone that wants to sign up. And then there's sort of that middle ground where you do a hybrid, where you've got some private cloud and then they're working with the public cloud. Together, these are called the 532 principle of cloud computing. This was back in 2012. Young Chow put that out, and I put a link here. And all my links are in my slides, and I'll put the slides up right after we finish this talk. So if anyone wants to download it and get to some of the links, they'll be available for you. But this is a nice, I like this. At the Army, we have a thing where when I'm giving a briefing to someone, they'll say, Dave, give me the bluff, give me the bottom line up front. And this one pager, they love it because I can quickly just, give them the pitch for why cloud computing, how it works and why it's beneficial. So I love this little 532 principle, and I can talk to it and give them the bottom line up front. So where's Azure at? Azure provides all of that: the infrastructure as a service, the platform as a service, the software as a service. If you think of Office 365, that's mainly software as a service. You could argue that it also has some platform as a service using like the Graph API, but these are Microsoft's offerings. So in Azure, you can obviously have SharePoint farms, SQL Server, you can have virtual machines. We're going to dive into some of that in a second here. When you start with Azure, there is a great resource that gets overlooked, Microsoft Learn, and they have a ton of documentation for Azure. And I say documentation, but I really, it's way more than that. It's hands-on labs, it's sandboxes, it's free credits, it's exam prep material. So they have done just a fantastic job with Microsoft has done a fantastic job with this resource, so that people can get spun up. I'm in a Facebook group of people that are studying for different Azure exams, and time again they talk about what resources did they use to study to pass the AZ 900 exam. They used Microsoft Learn, and they just went through some of these tutorials. So we'll talk about what some of those are in a second here. What types of services can we use in Azure? I keep mentioning virtual machines, so you can do a ton of different Windows virtual machines, and once you fire up a virtual machine, you can install whatever you want on it. You can install SharePoint, SQL Server, whatever. There's things like app services where you're just creating a web app. This is, again, so if a virtual machine is infrastructure as a service, now we're talking platform as a service, because now if I create a web app using the app service, I don't really care what operating system's running, right? I just care about the software I'm using to create the app, and I want it to run out there. Then things like SQL Server, database. Now, sometimes people get confused, because you can actually do a virtual machine and install a specific version of SQL Server. But then there is SQL Database, which is more platform as a service, where I'm just saying, hey, I just want SQL Server, and I don't really want to be responsible for updating the operating system or the SQL software. I just want to use the SQL database. Some other things, Linux virtual machines are out there, all your typical ones. And then I mentioned serverless computing. There's this idea of creating functions where you can process events with again, is there still hardware behind it? It's still running against some hardware, but you're not concerned with it. That's why they call that serverless code architecture. Now, this might be a little overwhelming. You might be saying to yourself, man, I got to create all these things. How do I get started? Is there code? How do I do it? Well, good news. There's a template for creating these resources. So Microsoft in the Azure portal, when you get started, you can say, hey, I want to create a virtual machine, and I'll choose the Windows Server 2016 virtual machine template, or the Ubuntu Server template, or a web app, or SQL. They all walk you through, just like if you were in Word and you wanted to create a new invoice, and there's a little template and it kind of gives you the format for an invoice. Same thing here. We'll walk through a couple of examples of these, because these are really powerful ways to get started quickly with Azure. What are some of the things you can create? I mentioned there's different types of compute, server fabric, container service, different types of networking, data and storage. This is not even complete. This is an old slide, but The good thing about those templates is that if you create a virtual machine, it needs a DNS and it needs a security network group, the template will create those 8, 9, however many resources are needed to support that virtual machine for you. So when we do our demo, you'll see that you don't have to create each one individually. You can if you want that kind of total control, but the templates are a great way to get started very easily. So I mentioned the Azure portal. This is the Azure portal. You go to portal.azure.com and to get started. And you usually, if you're just, you're just a professional, you'll sign up for a free trial. I think the current trial offers like 30 days for $200 in credit. A lot of students, we'll talk about how some students can get started. I know a couple of my students are on the call. You can get started using your student account. They have a different offer for students. But when you get to that portal, it takes you to all of those different resources and everything. Well, it's a little overwhelming. One thing you can do is you can use a dashboard to organize some of the things that you create. So in this example, they've got a private dashboard here, and they've got a tile for their service health, a shortcut to the marketplace, a tile for help and support. Let me actually take this opportunity to show you my Azure portal. So I'm going to go ahead and jump out here to a browser and bring up my Azure portal. So we'll whip that into shape here and type in portal.azure.com. And I'll log in with one of my accounts. I've got lots of different accounts. We'll pick this one. And under each account, you can have one or more subscriptions. And when you sign up for an Azure trial, it will create a subscription for you. So this particular account, I think, has 5 or 6 different subscriptions associated with it. That's why it's probably taken a second to log in and look everything up and bring everything up in the interface. So here we are. This is the default Azure homepage that lists some of the recent resources I've been working with, gives me some shortcuts to some other things. But what I like is the dashboards, because the dashboards help me. I go to my dashboards here, and you'll see I've got a couple different dashboards. This is one of my SharePoint dashboards, and it has links or tiles to some of the resources that I use to create a SharePoint farm. So in this particular one, I've got a SharePoint 3-server SharePoint farm. You'll see I've got Active Directory virtual machine, a SQL Server virtual machine, and a SharePoint web front-end virtual machine. Right now, they're not running. They're stopped. That's that on-demand service we talked about. I'm going to go ahead and start all 3 of them. So I'm going to go to the Azure machine, and you could do this via PowerShell. I actually have a command that I just run if I want to start all 3 of them. I'm doing it through the user interface just to show you how you would do it if you wanted to do it through user interface. So I started the Azure machine. Let me go start the SQL machine, and then I'll go start the web front-end. And you can see over here, it takes a minute or 2 for them to get up and get running under the notifications. So while they're there, let's go ahead and refresh that. So there's 2 of them are running, the other one's starting. We'll give that a second to bake. But this is the idea that, as I create these other, create a resource, so in addition to the SharePoint farm, it looks like I also have an AdventureWorks SQL database as part. Maybe with this particular dashboard, I created something in AdventureWorks that I wanted to ingest into SharePoint and present on a SharePoint page. So, I put that tile of that SQL database in the same dashboard as my SharePoint resources. So my SQL database is already up and running. I could, if I wanted to do something, there's a query editor that's built into to Azure that I could log into, and then it's reading my smart card. I don't need a smart card. Let's take that smart card out. Sorry about that. Yeah, do it this way. But yeah, I could log in here and then access my. So this is interesting. So it looks like I got my password right. But one of the tricks with a SQL Server database is you can set the firewall to only allow certain IP addresses. And it doesn't look like my current, whatever machine I logged on at the moment, was not allowed to access this server. So what I would need to do before I can log into it is actually go to the resource and go to the firewall and allow the current client IP. So let's do that real quick. And it's as you can see, it's pretty easy. I just clicked on firewall, added my current client IP, save that, and now it's going to update those firewall rules. But that's a typical thing you might have to work with, with this particular resource, a SQL Server resource. So now that I've done that, we'll try that one more time. See if we can log in. That's what I get for trying to use a saved password. password. Thank you. So this is me logged into my SQL Server now that I've allowed my IP address to access it. And you can see there's a bunch of different tables that I've got there. There's, if I want to actually query, say, the dogs table, I could run a query. And I don't have to use that was pretty lame because it was empty. But if I don't have to use the built-in, I could connect to SQL Server Management Studio. For those of you who are familiar with SQL Server Management Studio, I could use that to, let's just do customers so we can see some data. So there's some of my customers being returned. I can connect to it. So going back to that overview page, there's the IP address, the server name that I would need if I wanted to connect to it using SQL Server, some tool like SQL Server Management Studio, or access, whatever tool I'm using to connect to a SQL Server database. All the information here is in the overview, and this is just one resource that I've created in Azure that I placed on a dashboard. Now that I've done that, let's see if the SQL Server is running. So we'll go to my SQL Server web front end and grab that DNS name and see if we can log into it. Sometimes it does take a second for it to warm up. So even though it said it was running here, I may have jumped the gun, which is why it's spending a second here. But again, the idea is that by going to the overview of each of these virtual machines, you can see all the information about it. You can see whether it's running or not. You can view the cost. You can see the DSS name, the public IP address, how big this virtual machine is. It's 4 virtual CPUs, 14 gigs of RAM. Azure has names for these types. When I created this using a template, I used the size was DS3. And at the time I did this, I was using a 2012 data center template. Looks like it's not quite up yet. Let's try that again. There we go. So let's see if I can remember my password. And if this finally came up, it should show me some home page. Though typically these, I can't remember if this is one that I've been beating on. A favorite pastime of mine is to go and pull these pages up and then break them by installing crazy web parts or trying out weird settings, seeing if it still supports the old chart web part from 2007. So this one's spinning a little longer than I expected. I may have been in the middle of who knows what to the home page. So we'll give it a second to see if it renders okay. All right, so let's go back here. How do you get started? So I mentioned there's a free trial. There's a student has a special trial access, and there's also MSDN subscription credits. And I mentioned MSDN subscription credits because a lot of people don't realize that they have them. I've worked for a lot of companies over the last 30 years, and at least 8 or 9 of them I went into and I said, hey, you're either a Microsoft partner or you already have some enterprise service agreement. Do you have, typically they have some sort of a set of MSDN subscriptions that come with them, whether you're a partner or the service agreement or whatever. Are you using them? Can I have one? And again, every time, 100% of the time, they've like, oh yeah, no one's asked for them. Here's one. The current company I'm with, we get 55 of them. And, no one was using them when I started 8 or 9 years ago, or very few people, like 3 or 4 people. So now I make it a point to go and reach out to my developers and say, hey, here's the MSDN subscription. It comes with $150 of Azure credit every month. Please use this. And what I can do is, if for some reason someone's not using it, every 90 days I can take it from someone and give it to somebody else. So you should definitely, if you work for a larger company or a Microsoft partner, inquire, ask the IT department, do you have MSDN subscription credits? Could I get one for 90 days? You'd be surprised what the response might be like. As I mentioned, if you're a student, if you got an .edu email address, you can sign up for the $100 in credit that lasts for 12 months. So it's a little different than the professional trial, where it's 30 days and $200. As a student, you get $100 and it lasts for 12 months. The other thing is that using the trial, there's a bunch of free services that you can take advantage of. You can actually have a virtual machine running as long as it's small enough and it's in a certain limitations, it will run without using any credits. So that's an interesting benefit. This is just some screenshots showing you that when you sign up for a student, I made my daughter do this. She signed up, and the cool thing was, as a student, it has a special Azure Education Hub with specific information about downloading free software and documentation from Microsoft Learn, but it also didn't ask for a credit card. So I think that's really exciting for students to not have to worry about, hey, do I have to have a credit card? But if you're not a student, there is the Visual Studio Developer Essentials offer, and this, when you join this, it's free. It does ask you for a credit card to identify yourself. It assumes you're a professional and have a credit card. But I've had a couple of these for years. I've never been charged. When you sign up, you get the Azure account, 1 year free services that you can use that doesn't charge any credits, that you can run virtual machines. You also get $200 in credit where you can run any of the services, and they'll each credit, or they'll use your credit, but you can have a lot of fun with them. You also get access to the Azure DevOps portal, Visual Studio App Center, all sorts of other options. And here's some of those other things I'm talking about. You get Xamarin Controls, 6-month subscription, download Visual Studio Community Edition, Visual Studio Code, Power Apps Community Plan, if you want to start playing around with Power Apps. So again, you think Azure, you say, well, wait a minute, but I want to start learning about all these power tools. I'm a SharePoint person. Well, you can get the Power Apps Community Plan by signing up for the Visual Studio Dev Essentials subscription. And this just walks you through signing up. And again, the big problem here, not the problem, but the extra kind of is that they do ask for a credit card to identify yourself. But again, I've done this for years. I've been signed up multiple times, and they've never charged my credit card. So this is just a comparison, student versus essentials. I mentioned the 12 months for $100 as a student versus 1 month for $200 as a professional. What can you do with these trials? You can create virtual machines, and depending on the size, that we saw a D3 earlier, that was about 56 cents an hour. So if I left that running 24/7, it'd be about $417 a month. That would eat up my credit right away. But again, the key is on-demand self-service. So, or pay for what you use. You turn these things on, you play with them, you turn them off. Not meant for production, but for development and testing, works just great. So let's do a demo. Let me show you how to create your first virtual machine. And to do that, I'm going to use one of the articles, one of the tutorials in Microsoft Learn documentation. This is the Windows virtual machine in Azure, and there's a couple different versions of the Quick Start. So there's one for doing it through the portal using the user interface. There's another one for creating a virtual machine using PowerShell, one for using the Azure command line interface, and one for using an ARM template. So we're going to keep it simple. We're going to stick with the portal version. And again, the links are built in here, so I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And when you get the slides, if you want to repeat this, you can do the same thing. So we'll go in here and we'll do the create the Windows virtual machine, and we're going to do it through the portal. And it walks you through this quick start. It really a few minutes to do it here. So the first thing it tells you to do is to sign in. We've already signed into Azure. Well, the first thing it tells you to do is sign into create a free account. So if you haven't signed up, then sign into the portal. Then go into search virtual machines and click add. So, and then I'm going to go through this, but I'll just walk through it real quick. Then it has you fill out some of the details of the virtual machine. It's not a whole lot. And then once you do it, you'll provision the virtual machine, connect to it using a remote desktop client, and you can install a web server, you can add different code, so whatever you're interested in. So let's go ahead and walk through this kind of quickly. We'll go into our portal. We'll go back to the main home page. Help if I type the right URL. So while I'm doing that question, has both Azure and cloud computing been able to support the high traffic since the rapid virtual environment increased due to COVID-19? That's a great question, Angela. I don't know the answer to that. My gut says it has. I mean, we're running now. Everything's up. It's not without its hiccups, right? There have been a few hiccups. So, I don't think it's a black or white. I don't think it's a yes or no question. I think for the most part it has. We're still, most companies, there's still a lot of big companies that depend on Azure and they're running. But there's been a few hiccups. Now, is it because of the increased traffic? Probably, and I'm sure there's studies out there that talk about that and argue one way or the other. So that'd be an interesting research topic to look into that and say, what has been the effect? How has Microsoft, addressed it. How is some of the other cloud providers doing? You've got some real, give me some real food for thought there. So great question. All right, so let's go through this demo. We're going to go ahead, like I said, they said to come in here and type virtual machines, right? So that's what we'll do according to the thing. And then we're going to add a virtual machine. And that's going to bring up the templates where we can choose what kind of virtual machine we want to create, give it a name, and all that other stuff. So that's what we're doing here. Notice there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different tabs that we're going to work through, all with a little bit of information that we need to fill in. So the first thing it says is what subscription. If you just sign up for one trial, you only have one. I've signed up for a couple different things, so I've got a few to choose from. I'll stick with my Visual Studio Enterprise subscription. Resource group is the next thing it asks for. When I create a virtual machine using the template, it's going to create a virtual machine, a network security group, a DNS, several different resources. So we want to group them all under one name. It makes it easy to get rid of when I'm done, also to find it and find the related things. So it's a good idea. Well, you have to group them in some sort of, a similar fashion. So we'll call this Cali 2021, my resource group. And did I click create new? There we go. Cali. I could use an existing one, but I like to create a new one for these demos. Virtual machine. So we'll just again call this Cali VM. Now these are those regions that we saw earlier on and you can see we've got the East Coast. We've got East Coast. There's two in the East Coast. South Central. Notice you won't see any of the DoDs here. I'm logged in as a regular just civilian at this point, so I don't have access to just to the regular ones here. But notice, I could put something out in Europe or Asia. I actually used this once. One time we were testing some software that was supposed to measure or monitor traffic. So being a DoD contractor, we wanted to see if anyone was coming in from outside the U.S. So we had some software that would tell where the traffic was coming from, and if someone was coming from outside the U.S., it was supposed to throw a flag. So I created a virtual machine in Korea, and then I logged into that virtual machine, which was in the Korea data center, and then connected back to my account, and the software didn't pick it up. And so we were like, hey, what's going on? And they were, oh, you didn't tweak it for that. And I was like, wait a minute. But it was an interesting way if you wanted to do that kind of, if you wanted to simulate traffic from outside the U.S., you could create a virtual machine in a data center in Korea and do it. So we're not going to do that here. We're going to keep it simple. We're going to put this in South Central. How's that? Actually, yeah, it's fine. And then next thing it asks us for is ability options. This has to do with redundancy. I'm keeping everything simple. I don't, this was a production environment. I would want to investigate how I'm going to create redundancy, how to make it available. But in this case, I don't want any infrastructure redundancy. Number one, that makes it cheaper. It's going to use my credits less. And number two, this is just a demo dev test, so I don't need that kind of redundancy. The image, which image do I want to use? You've got different choices here. I'm going to go with the 2019 Data Center Gen 1. It showed me the popular ones. If there was more, I could see all images and that'll list all the images, but I'll stick with the popular ones at the moment. So let's go back. Oh, I lost my whole thing. All right, that's okay. The other thing, actually, since I came back here, I wanted to show you that the other way to get this started is if you just go to Home and click Create a Resource. It's slightly different, but the difference here is now it shows you not just virtual machines. It shows you popular, some virtual machines, web apps, SQL, so whatever you want to create. So we will still stick with the virtual machine one. Jump back in there. Let's see, is my Cali one in there? I didn't finish my my template, so it never created the Cali. So let me create that again. Cali 2021. Actually, we'll put it in the West, right? This is California, so we'll do West US. No infrastructure. Windows 2016 sounds good. Spot instances. If I want to make this cheap, it's this idea that they can basically turn you off, and it'll charge you less for that capability. The size, this is some of those sizes I mentioned, D4, D3, B4, how many CPUs, how much memory, and depending on what you choose, like this is a smaller one, it's going to be less per month. But be careful, you don't want to choose a small one for running SharePoint or it'll run like a dog. Down here, we'll choose username, password. I've got a super complex password that I never remember. And confirm that. That's probably the hardest part of this whole wizard is typing in the password. Ports. So, there's a firewall, and I can change this after I provision it, but this just lets me, some of the more popular ones. Typically I want an RDP, I want a remote desktop in, so 3389, I probably will allow this. And they mentioned, if this was in production, maybe you want to turn that off, because you can always turn it on and off at will, which is a better, more secure posture. But in this case, it's just test, so we're going to leave that port open. If it was a website, I might also turn on, 80 and 443, so whatever, whatever makes sense. Licensing down here, it talks about, hey, if you already purchased a license, it's no sense paying for a license. So you check this box and say, yes, I already have a license, and now it's going to charge me less, 49% less, because maybe I already purchased Windows. What was this? Windows 2016. So next, it asked me about my disks. What kind of operating system disk do I want? There's 3 types: standard, HDD, SSD, and then premium SSD. And as you might imagine, this is the most expensive, this is second expensive, and this is the cheapest. So again, for my dev test ones, I usually tell people just do standard HDD. You'll save, you'll make your credits last longer. The encryption type, I usually just accept the default. Ultra disk compatibility, next. Networking, I usually, these next few slides or next few tabs, I'm usually just accepting the defaults, especially if this is just dev test machine. So it's going to create a virtual network, it's going to create a subnet, it's going to create a public IP address, basic, we already picked the ports, that all looks good. Next, management. The one thing I like to change here is to shut down. So I do want, usually these, if I'm using these machines 9 to 5, 7 p.m. my time is usually a good time to shut them down. And I get an email so I can cancel the shutdown if I want, if I'm working late one night, but I do like to change this to whatever time I'm in. So we'll set it to California time. I can enable backups, I can enable patch installation. I can install other extensions, there's other software, and finally, if I want to give it a tag, maybe this is for a certain department, so I could say this is for the HR department, I can add a tag there. Finally, if I've typed in everything correctly, I got my password with the proper, lowercase, uppercase, and all that, it'll give me a validation passed, it'll give me an estimate of how much it's going to cost, and it'll give me the opportunity to create it. Also, it'll give me the opportunity to download a template for automation. So this is the JSON, the JavaScript object notation with all the parameters that I chose, and it even gives me some scripts, the PowerShell script or the command line interface script, so that I could then just run this. I won't have to go through all those, clicks again. I can just run this automated. Now, I keep saying the Azure command line interface. If you don't know what that is, I'll show you that in just a second here, but basically it's this guy up here. It's basically PowerShell in your browser from the cloud. So we'll put a pin in that and come right back to that. So let's go back to our virtual machine and create it. And just like when we started our previous virtual machines that were created already, this one is being started, but it's more than being started, it's being provisioned first. So the deployment is in process. It actually has to provision, a machine and then install that, or get that software ready to go. Then it started. You can even see over here the different steps. So it created the virtual machine, created the network, created the network security group, created the IP address, created the virtual network. So you can see each step. This one's not done yet. That one's still running. It's the whole thing, right? And these are those different pieces, the different resources. That's why we put them in a resource group, so they're all grouped together. All right, so we'll do a Martha Stewart. We'll let that bake in the oven, and we'll come back to our previous dashboard, and I'll show you one that's done. So this is remember these 3 virtual machines we started earlier, and we were trying, there we are. We did eventually log into our SharePoint farm. This is that web front end I'm running. Here's something that always throws a few people for a loop. This is running in Azure, right? These virtual machines are running in Azure, but this is an on-premises farm because I can access the C drive. I can do customizations just like I was on premises. I can go to my web front end. I can do a connect and remote desktop into my web front end. It's important when I connect to my web front end that I don't use the private address. That's not accessible via the internet. So if I try to do a download RDP file and connect, it's going to fail. And I've done that plenty of times. So I want to choose either the public IP address for the load balancer or the DNS name. I like to choose the DNS name, so that's what we'll choose. Now I can download the remote desktop file, and then do a connection. It's saying, hey, I don't know this publisher. Yeah, I know, I just created it. Let me type in my password. And yep, I created this. It doesn't have the proper certificate, which is why it warned me, but I know it's mine, so I trust it. And now I'm logging in. It's like if I walked down the hall to my server room and logged into an on-premises server. I'm just doing it via the internet. I've logged in this server. It's out in the cloud somewhere. This one is actually in South Central U.S., so it's in that data center somewhere in the South Central U.S. But I can do anything as if I was sitting in front of the server. In fact, the server manager is going to come up by default. If I minimize that, you'll see I've got Microsoft Access on here and some of the other Office tools I downloaded. I've got Visual Studio Code on here. I downloaded a product called Control Point. Adobe's on here. Microsoft Teams is on here. I can central admin. A lot of people like to run central admin for on-premises services to do, to configure your SharePoint. So this is actually SharePoint 2013. But again, it's funny. It's an on-premises server running in the Azure cloud, and this is great for developers that are still supporting on-premises solutions, because now they can go in, they can test things out without having to use their production, which they wouldn't do anyway, of course not. But they also don't have to, fight with if they've got some sort of like shared QA or even a shared development. It's really tough to do development on premises when you're sharing with someone else. So they have their own. They can do whatever they want. If they blow it up, they can throw it away and then create a fresh one. So that's really the big benefit of having this ability to leverage Azure for these virtual machines to create SharePoint farms and SQL Server databases and all that good stuff. So that was the quick start creating the Azure. And before I leave that, I tell you I put a pin in that one thing. So this icon up here is that command line interface, Azure command line interface. And if you click that, it will bring up PowerShell in the browser, and uses the first time you do it, it'll provision a storage in your Azure, because it does need someplace to store whatever you're typing in there. So the first time I did it, it said, hey, I'm going to provision storage. I said, fine, do it. And I did it. And now I've got this Azure cloud. What I love about this is that you can either use Bash or you can use PowerShell. I like to actually do PowerShell. You can convert to PowerShell or switch, but you can do either one. But the nice thing about this is if you're ever on a machine, like I sometimes am when I'm working for the Army, where I don't have administrator access, I can't run necessarily PowerShell, I can still open up a browser and run the Azure command line interface and run PowerShell commands inside my browser without having admin access to the machine that I'm on. So this is a really cool, convenient, powerful tool for when I need to do some things, but I may not be, be on a machine that has PowerShell and the Azure snap-in loaded locally. So once this guy finishes provisioning, you could go in there and you could type your regular PowerShell commands. I could grab that template that we just created and run it there to automate, creation of more virtual machines if I wanted. All right. And like I said, if you want to have practice creating a virtual machine using Azure PowerShell, there is a tutorial to walk through that, and I highly recommend doing that. It's great to kind of get that muscle memory of typing out the commands or even just copying and pasting the commands. And I actually teach a class in Intro to Cloud Computing where I make people go through this tutorial because it's a real good exercise to learn those commands. What about SharePoint? Guess what? There's a couple different ways you can create SharePoint farms using Azure. There's 3 ways I want to discuss. One is the hard, long way, and there's a great little article from my friend Keith Mayer that talks about creating each one of the virtual machines that you need and some of the other resources that you need. So it walks through creating that virtual machine, the front end, the SQL virtual machine, the AD virtual machine, the network security group, the subnet, creating, running the PowerShell commands to create everything, running in the other commands. Now, when you see all this code, there are parameters that you need to replace. So it is a bit of work to go through this and then replace the resource group name with your resource group name. Replace the the other parameters, your storage account name with what your storage account name is. So it's a bit of work. It is a lot of code, and most people, when I show this to them, are like, "Oh my gosh, Dave, do I have to do that?" So the answer is no. That's a great comment, Sasha. I appreciate that. You don't have to do that. There is an easier and yet still long way. And again, Keith Mayer from Microsoft, great guy, provided a slightly easier way with a great PDF. I'm running up on time. I'll get through this real quick. A great PDF that walks through, basically walking through the GUI. 5 different exercises walking through the GUI to create the your SharePoint virtual farm. Definitely a lot easier. Now, the easiest way again, Keith Mayer, thank you, bless his heart, he walks through this great article where you can use there's a wizard. In 8 clicks, you can create a SharePoint farm in Azure. So a nice little template. You walk through, you say, I want a non-high availability or a high availability. Non-high availability is cheaper. And in 8 clicks, you specify what the name of the farm is, your resource, you choose sizes for your virtual machines, and that quickly, in about 15 minutes, it provisions a SharePoint farm. And that's how most of my SharePoint farms are created. That's the best way to do it. If you want to add 2016, or that particular wizard is for 2013, it's very easy to add another virtual machine, connect to that virtual machine, install another SharePoint 2016 or SharePoint 2019, and just take advantage of the same SQL Server and all the other resources that are created by the wizard to have 2016 and 2013 running side by side. I had this slide here because if you were to do this, there is a pre-install error. You just ignore that, and it keeps going. And it's very easy to add an additional farm to the 2013 farm that the template creates. There is a 2019 farm wizard now out there too. So if you want to create either a 2013 farm or a 2019 farm, there's wizards for that in Azure. As I mentioned, definitely check out the documentation from Microsoft Learn. Great tutorials. They walk you through a whole 8 hours of Azure fundamentals that prepare you for the AZ900 exam. There's sandboxes where you activate a sandbox and it uses their credits. You don't have to use your own credits. And if you want to start integrating with SharePoint Online, I highly encourage people to join the Microsoft 365 Developer Program. That gets you started with not Azure, but the other side of Microsoft's cloud, which is the Office 365. Joining this program actually has you create it creates for you an Office 365 tenant with 25 users that's free for 90 days. And this is the one that I have, as long as you use it, it will automatically renew every, this one actually I wasn't using, so this one did expire. But other ones that I've done that I continue to use, I get emails every month or every 3 months to say, hey, you've been using it, it's been automatically renewed. I've had one for at least 4 or 5 years. So a great resource to do Office 365 without having to pay any money. Last thing I'll throw out there as we run out of time here is that there's the dev chat online. If you're doing stuff in Azure and you have questions, Microsoft, this used to be a partner-only resource, but you can go to this link and chat with an Azure engineer from Microsoft, and you can say, hey, I was trying to create serverless computing, this function that interfaced with SharePoint, and it wasn't working. What should I be doing? What am I doing wrong? Do the dev chat with them. They'll steer you in the right direction. A lot of times they'll send you code and say, this is the kind of code you need. It really, really valuable resource that's available to everyone now. So that's all I have. I really appreciate everyone sticking around. Hopefully you got a few tips and tricks from this. Let me know if you have questions. I know a lot of times it's a lot of information. The cup is full, it's overflowing, and you won't think of questions till later. If you do think of a question later, feel free to tweet me at Dave E. Patrick on Twitter. Thanks for attending and appreciate your time.